And good afternoon and welcome. My name is Derek Olson. I am the president of World Oregon, and we have a fabulous webinar for you today with John Ghazvinian on America and Iran, a history 720 to the present. Before we start with that, just a few words of opening. Thank you for joining us today. As a reminder, the Zoom webinar, for those of you who haven't joined us before on one, the video and audio is just for World Oregon staff and our guest speaker. We encourage you to post questions for the speaker in the Q&A function of Zoom. And in the chat, we will post links of interest, including a link to Broadway Books, our local independent bookstore partner who is selling this book, America and Iran, A History 720 to the Present. And there's the link that Tim, my colleague, the director of programs, just posted. As those of you who have joined us before will know, Tim will join us later in the broadcast for moderating questions from the audience. So get your questions ready, post them in the Q&A, not in the chat, please. That's where we'll post links. Thank you for all those who joined us yesterday for the powerful discussion about the Uyghurs in China and that really horrific situation. That, if you missed it, is now up on YouTube, as well as a number of other programs that we've done in the last several weeks. So go to the World Oregon YouTube channel. I'll post that channel here in the chat, but it's also linkable from our website. We have a program coming up this weekend with Long Reads, which is our young professionals steering committee hosts this. This is a discussion group about a short article. Think of one like in the Atlantic or the New Yorker, that type of a length article. If you haven't joined that before, it's kind of a neat twist on the book group idea. Again, thanks to all of you who are members or supporters or helped us yesterday on Giving Tuesday. Your donations and support make programs like this possible. And now, without further ado, to today's program, we're thrilled to be partnering and really joining with the paperback release of this book. He's an expert who was born in Iran, raised in London and Los Angeles, has a doctorate in history from Oxford University, and the recipient of a public scholar fellowship with the National Endowment for Humanities a couple years ago, as well as a fellowship with the Carnegie Corporation Special Initiative on Islam before that. He's appeared in a number of publications in his writing: Newsweek, Sunday Times, New Statement, Slate, and The Nation, and currently directs the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and is coming to us from Philadelphia. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Derek, for that very kind introduction, and for inviting me to come and speak to World Oregon. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually. Of course, I wish it were possible for me to be out there in Portland with you. I hope there'll be other occasions for that in the future. So I'm going to just speak to you just very informally for about 20 minutes or so about the book. As Derek mentioned, the book came out in January originally, America and Iran. This was the hardback edition, and it is coming out this week in this stylish new paperback edition. So if you'd like to save a couple of bucks, that's one way to do it. You can order the paperback. So America and Iran, I think we're all vaguely aware of the fact that the United States and Iran do not have a very good relationship. In fact, they have no relationship. They've had no relationship since April of 1980, diplomatically, at least officially, which is a pretty long time to go without speaking to an enemy. So I think when we talk about the history of this relationship, there is this kind of natural tendency to want to ask the question, well, what happened? Where did it go so wrong? Why is this so bad? That's a perfectly reasonable question to ask, and I understand where it comes from. But as a historian, it puts me in a strange position, because when the question is being asked, like, well, so explain to us what went wrong, how did things get so bad? I think the other question that's also being asked implicitly, the question that's kind of embedded in that is, well, whose fault is it, right? Who started it? Why did this go so wrong? Who do we blame? And again, that's a reasonable impulse, but history doesn't work that way. And as a historian, you don't want to approach your subject that way. So I was trying really hard not to do that in this book. Whether I succeeded or not is up to you all, up to readers and critics. But what was important to me was to try to get away from some of that blame game narrative. I mean, this is not a courtroom. That's not what history is about. I'm not sitting here as a judge and a jury adjudicating who we blame for these problems. The reality is that it's very complex, and that there's been a series of frustrations and grievances and antagonisms that have built up over the years. The other side of that, though, as a historian, the question becomes, well, where do you begin the story, right? And that's where what I really kind of struggled with when I was doing this book, because obviously plenty of books have been written on the history of US-Iran relations, and more books will be written again in the future. But I was trying to do something a little bit different, which was to get away from the immediate history of just the antagonism. And something very interesting happens when you do that, because you realize that over the 200-year, 300-year history of these two countries, actually, there hasn't been that much antagonism. It's been a largely positive relationship, full of mutual fascination, mutual admiration, even at times a kind of mutual idealization, which was surprising to me to discover, because you look at the last 40 years of history and you don't expect that necessarily. And that's what happens when you look at the deeper, longer history of this relationship. But I don't think you do that just out of idealism or just out of idle curiosity. I think that this early history has things to teach us. But before we get to that, I think the question that I want to talk about a little bit is, again, where do you begin? Where do you begin this history? And I think traditionally speaking, those who have taken an interest in the history of US-Iran relations have begun their narratives in one of two places. One of those places is, if you are, broadly speaking, very kind of pro-American foreign policy, very critical of Iran, critical of the Islamic Republic, you're likely to begin your history in 1979. That was the year when the very pro-American regime of the Shah of Iran was overthrown in a revolution, an Islamic revolution that replaced the government with an Islamic Republic, which we have today. And that was also the year in which, during the revolution, a handful of radicalized students took over the American embassy in Tehran and held its employees hostage for over a year. Of course, that very famous hostage crisis, which some of you may remember. And there is this tendency to say, well, that's where things went wrong. Everything was fine until, because after 1979, now you have this government that's less friendly to the US, and that's where all the problems have begun. If you are more critical of the US, more critical of American foreign policy, or perhaps more sympathetic to Iran or the Islamic Republic, you might be more likely to begin your story in 1953. That, of course, was the year in which the CIA helped to overthrow a very popular government in Iran, a very popular prime minister by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized the oil industry and had angered the British government and the British oil industry by nationalizing the oil company. There is a tendency, and of course, once Mossadegh was overthrown, the US gave its full backing to the Shah, the king of Iran, who gradually drifted towards autocracy and dictatorship by the end of the 1970s, which then resulted in the backlash in 1979. Both of these are perfectly reasonable places to begin the story, but in both cases, what you're actually saying is everything was fine until. Everything was fine until these radical, angry Iranian revolutionaries took over the embassy, and or everything was fine until the US overthrew the Iranian government. I mean, that's fine, but the problem is, well, was everything really fine? Was everything really great before 1979? Well, there were good relations between the two countries, but there was a real undercurrent of resentment, right, and popular anger against the regime. Was everything fine before 1953? Well, maybe in some ways there was a sort of, but was there a sort of golden age of US-Iran relations? That's not so clear, right? I think there's often a tendency, again, when you begin with the question, how did it all go so wrong? There's this implication of, well, it must have gone right at some point. But people have a harder time articulating what that might have looked like, So that was what I was trying to find out with this book. Was there a time when everything went right? And if so, how? How did everything go so right? Well, it turns out there never was really a true golden age of US-Iran relations when everything was wonderful. Although you can point to the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s as perhaps a better time, a more innocent time in a lot of ways. So you'll forgive me. I don't know if you can hear all that. There's a lot of noise from the window here. So if you just give me 1 second, I'm just going to close my window and keep talking. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks. So the question becomes, where do you begin if you don't begin with 1953 or 1979? And a lot of historians, a lot of American historians have done this, have started around 1940. Why? Because before the 1940s, before Pearl Harbor, the US was a very isolationist power, not really interested in places like Iran. So naturally, when you look at the US archives, the State Department archives, you realize that there's not much to look at before the 1940s. So, who cares? There's a bit of a problem with that way of looking at it, right? Which is that is saying that the history only becomes important when the United States becomes interested in Iran. So I actually went to Iran a few times and looked at Iranian archives as well. And it turns out that actually for 80, 90 years before 1940, dating all the way back to the 1850s, the Iranian government, successive Iranian governments, were actually very interested in cultivating a better relationship with the United States. And that to me is just as interesting a part of the story. The very first disagreement these two countries ever had actually took place in the 1850s. And the question you're asking, well, what were they arguing about in the 1850s, right? Well, it turns out this is when they were negotiating their first ever treaty of friendship. And it turns out that one of the sticking points on that treaty was that the Iranians wanted to buy US warships flying the Stars and Stripes, manned by American sailors, to fly, to cruise in the Persian Gulf under the auspices of the Persian Navy, to send a message to the British and the Russians, who at the time were interfering a lot in Iranian affairs, and to say, look at us, we have a new powerful ally in the US. And the Americans were saying, no, I'm sorry, we can't do this. We're not going to get involved in your business like this. That was the first disagreement. With the Iran saying to the US, we want you more involved in our affairs, and the US saying, no, we don't want to be involved in Iran's affairs. Which, if you know anything about US-Iran relations today, will surprise you, because it is the literal opposite of where we are today, right? That dispute took over 5 years to negotiate, longer than it took to negotiate the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, right? So I could just start there. I could start with the diplomatic history, but I think that, when you privilege just politics, when you're presenting a certain kind of narrative, and I think that the relationship between the US and Iran is about much more than just politics and diplomacy. So I wanted to go back even further than the 1850s, to the first human contacts between Iranians and Americans, in the 1830s, when you had American Presbyterian missionaries going over to Iran, building schools and clinics and trying to convert people to Presbyterian Christianity. But I wanted to go back even further than just the first human contact. I wanted to go back to the first preconceived notions, the first impressions that these two civilizations had of each other. And that may seem like an eccentric choice, but I'm glad I did, because some interesting things came out of that. So I looked at some of the first newspapers published in colonial North America, in Philadelphia and Boston in the 1720s, expecting to find nothing about Iran, and found that they were obsessed with Iran, or as they called it at the time, Persia. Came across newspapers where 25%, 30% of the newspaper was taken up by Persia, by what was going on in Iran. Came across a newspaper in 1724 in Philadelphia, published in Philadelphia, where the leading story, the top headline was, "We regret that we have no news from Persia this week." This was front page news in the American colonies in 1724. "We're sorry, we have no news from Iran this week." That blew my mind. And it should surprise you as well. So the obvious question is why? Why in the 1720s were American newspapers consumed with Iran? And by the way, not just consumed with Iran, very, very vocally, stridently pro-Iranian, which might also surprise you. Well, it turns out that, so this is when the newspaper industry began in North America. The very first newspapers published were around 1720. And it turns out, it just happened to be that the big international news story of its day was the collapse of the Persian Empire in 1722 at the hands of the Afghan rebels in the East, led by Mahmud Hotaki in 1722. Now, why would they care? Well, it was just a big international news story, but the Afghans were rebelling against the Persians because the Persians were trying to force them to convert from Sunni to Shia Islam. And so Americans assumed that they were colluding secretly with the Ottoman Empire, which was also Sunni, against the Persian Empire, which was Shia. Now, that wasn't actually the case, but the facts don't matter. What matters is perception. And it's interesting that they would kind of twig onto this in this way, right? Why were they so pro-Iranian, so concerned with the collapse of the Persian Empire? Well, it turns out that they hated the Ottoman Empire so much that the idea that a Sunni rebellion in the East against the Shia Persian Empire must be somehow supported by the Sunni Ottoman Empire, which to them at the time was the hated evil empire of the day. Remember that the Ottoman Empire, as recently as 1683, had been at the gates of Vienna. That's only 40 years earlier than these newspapers are being published. 40 years. That was as recent to people as the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis is to us, right? The Ottoman Empire, the Turks, were seen as the great, at the time, they were seen by white Christian Europeans. And remember that settlers in North America in the 1720s would have seen themselves as British subjects, right? Not, citizens of the United States. The US didn't exist yet at the point this time. They saw themselves as European Christians, and the greatest threat to European Western Christianity at the time was the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. And they were aware that the two great empires of the Middle East were the Ottomans and the Persians, and they were rivals. So it was the old thing of my enemy is my friend. So they liked the Persians, just for that reason. They didn't know much about them, but they knew that they were great rivals of the Ottomans. They also liked the Persians because they were Shia, and they were vaguely aware of the fact that the mainstream Muslim world was Sunni, and the Shia were seen as heretics, and they were a minority. So they were seen as somehow less Muslim, and therefore less evil, less threatening. You had newspapers that talked about, that actually tried to explain to people in 1720s in Philadelphia and Boston, the difference between Shia and Sunni Islam. Not very well, but they tried. You had a newspaper I saw that actually described this as a rivalry between Muslims and Persians, which is a very interesting way of describing it, right? Muslims and Persians, as if somehow Persians are not Muslim. They liked that. Yeah, that was one more thing they liked about Persia. But it wasn't just that. There was also the religious aspect to it, the Christian religious aspect to it. Remember that Christian Europeans had been fighting crusades against the Turks for centuries. And the Turks and the Ottomans, Seljuk Turks and then Ottoman Turks, were in possession of the Holy Land, of Jerusalem and all the holy sites. And that really upset Christian Europeans. But when they looked at the Persians, they saw this empire that was just to the east of that. Just to the east of all the important Christian holy sites, less threatening, less Muslim, less less of a threat to Christianity, less of a threat to their way of life, less of a threat to Western Europe, and the rival of their great threat. So for all of these reasons, they kind of liked that. And that wasn't even, that was only, there was more to that. There was also the Bible, right? If you're living in colonial North America in the 1720s, you don't know anything about contemporary Iran. The only thing you know about the Middle East is what you've read about in the Bible. And in the Bible, the Persians look really good, right? Cyrus the Great liberates the Jews from Babylonian captivity in Ezra book 1. You have the three magi, the three wise men from the east. Magi, I don't know if you know what that word means. It's the plural of magus, which comes from the Persian word mog, which means a Zoroastrian priest. So the three wise men, they were probably Iranian. So these are the ways that, so Iran looks good in the Bible. The Ottomans, on the other hand, they don't exist yet in the Bible, but they're seen as the heirs of Babylon, which is everything evil, right? So here you have this kind of Eastern exotic Oriental kingdom that's slightly to the east of everything that they hate. And I call my opening chapter East of Eden for that reason. There's this kind of idealized idea about Persia. Now, why am I going on and on about this? This is 300 years ago. Why does this matter? Because fast forward 100 years to 1834, and the very first Presbyterian American missionary who arrives in Iran, and you read his memoirs, and it's amazing. He treks all across the Ottoman Empire, all across Anatolia. He hates it. He's the evil Turks, the terrible Turks, the barbarous Turks. And then he climbs over the mountains into the Urumia plain, the Salmas plain around Urumia in northwestern Iran. And the word he uses to describe it is Edenic. Edenic, like the Garden of Eden, like a sort of paradise. This is the mental baggage that Americans bring to Iran before they even arrive, before they even have any real contact, before they even meet a real life Iranian. And it matters. These ideas have afterlives. If you're living in the United States in the 1970s, some of you may remember, when you think about the Middle East, what do you think of? When you think of the Arab world, you think of socialist regimes, Ba'athist regimes, wars with Israel, the Arab oil embargo, all these horrible things you don't like, airplane hijackings. But when you look at Iran, just to the east of all of that, you see this glorious emperor and his beautiful empress and their crown jewels and their coronation ceremonies, and they're very pro-American. And it's just like this nice, beautiful, fairy tale, harmless kind of kingdom, just to the east of everything that you don't like. That is the world that was lost in 1979 for Americans, this idea of Iran. Right? Now, Iranians have their own version of this, which we don't have as much time for. But it starts a little bit later. It starts in the 1860s, and for a different set of reasons. Iranians have this great empire which collapses, or rather begins to decline by the 19th century. And they're aware of the fact that the West, that Europe is advancing, the Industrial Revolution, and so on. And they want to emulate and learn from the West, but they don't like the interference and the imperialism and the greed that they see from the British, the Russians, the French, who are all interfering in Persian affairs, the great game in Central Asia. And they look at the US, and they see a country that came to power in a revolution against the British Empire, and they like that. A country that doesn't seem to interfere in other countries' affairs, and they like that. A country that has sent Presbyterian missionaries to Iran, where they're building schools and clinics, but there is no American embassy in Tehran. The American government isn't interested. They don't want to get involved, and they like that. So there's almost like a West of Eden version. It's a similar kind of thing, right? They look at Europe and they don't like what they see, but they look slightly further to the West and they see what they see as a European country, because they looked at the US as a European country at the time, but that is less evil, less threatening than the Europeans. And this matters because this stays with them throughout the 19th century, throughout the early 20th century. As late as July 1953, 3 weeks before the CIA overthrows Mohammad Mossadegh, he writes a letter to Eisenhower because the British are imposing sanctions on Iran and he's not getting the money that he needs, and he asks for a loan from the US. He asks for help from the US. Why? Because he believes that the US is the one country that will understand Iran's predicament and its problems that it's having with the British Empire. That's 3 weeks before the CIA overthrows his government, right? As late as that, there is still a belief that the US understands where we're coming from. That's the world that was lost in 1953 for Iranians. So both countries have this idealized version of themselves that exists throughout most of their history. And it's a tragedy that that's been lost in both directions. But when I look at the broader history, I'm not an optimist. I don't think we're about to suddenly embark on a great period of US-Iranian friendship, but I am an idealist. I tend to look at it and I see that there's no reason why it needs to be this way, right? So I'll stop there and I'll open this up to questions as just kind of a general overview of the broad history, but I'm happy to talk about whatever is on your minds. And I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, John. This is Tim DeRoche, Director of Programs here at World Oregon. I'm curious, as somebody who, you were born in Iran, you were raised in England and in Erangeles or Los Angeles. What is your relationship with Iran these days, and what's your relationship with the broader Iranian diaspora?
Well, I haven't been to Iran since 2009. I went 3 times to do the research for this book. And I haven't been back since for no reason other than just I was busy working on the book, and then politically things got really bad. It didn't feel like the right time. I also had other things going on in my life. And then after the JCPOA, I just got kind of busy. So, I haven't been to Iran since 2009. Yeah, I was born in Iran. I left Iran when I was 1 year old, actually, and grew up in the UK, and then later in Los Angeles. And I was actually never very connected to the Iranian diaspora, the Iranian community. This is an interest that developed a bit later. It's a topic that sort of found me a little bit, as I became kind of gradually more interested in it.
So you mentioned the JCPOA, which I think is probably on a lot of people's minds. Certainly with a new administration, there was a lot of renewed interest in, are we going to rejoin it? Ian Bremmer, wonderful analyst and watcher of global issues, mentioned casually on Twitter yesterday that the Iranians were 4 weeks away from nuclear breakout capability. What are your thoughts on re-entering the JCPOA with this administration? And do we need to be concerned in the way that the issue is being painted in the press?
The second part of that question, the answer is very much yes, because the way it's painted in the press is the diametric opposite of the reality. And I kind of explained that in my book. But in terms of the JCPOA and the likelihood of being able to rejoin it, look, I'm not a fortune teller. I'm a historian. I go in the other direction. I go I'm more interested in the past than the future. Look, honestly, I think that ship has sailed. I don't think we're likely to get back into. I could be wrong, and this is going to be on YouTube, so people can use this against me. But I don't see the two parties going back into the JCPOA in the same way that they had in 2015. I just think too much has changed now on both sides. There isn't enough political incentive, or desire, frankly, in either country. Iran would very much like to see sanctions removed. They feel very aggrieved by the way that the US walked out of the deal 3 years after signing it, and just simply imposed more sanctions, even more sanctions than that had been imposed before the deal, more sanctions than anyone even thought possible. And they just sort of feel like, well, what is there to talk about here? You come back to the deal. Iran did actually maintain its commitments in the deal for well over a year after the US pulled out, and then began slowly increasing your enrichment, just to kind of mostly, I think, to make a point. But people will disagree with that. Took a number of kind of steps that are reversible. They could still reverse. I mean, both parties could go back into the deal, but the reason I think they won't, on the Iranian side, it's very destabilizing to your economy to spend years negotiating a deal, believing that you're going to, building up all this anticipation that sanctions are going to be removed, have sanctions be removed for some sanctions removed for 3 years, find that a lot of businesses are still, and banks are still very wary about going back into the country partly because of political pressure, and then have the US walk out of the deal and have all those sanctions be reimposed in addition to 800 more sanctions. Frankly, they have found ways around these sanctions and found ways to build up what they call a resistance economy. I mean, you can call it what you want, but find a way, what countries always do, which is to simply circumvent all of this. And frankly, removal of sanctions, it would be desirable for Iran only if it was permanent and enduring. If it's just going to be a couple of years, they're not interested. And the US is not going to be able to provide the kind of guarantee that Iran needs. There's no way that Joe Biden can say this deal will remain in place forever, and if a Republican wins in 2024, like he's going to have no way of repealing it. They can't do that. There are mechanisms, I think, that could be negotiated, and maybe there will. But from the American side, meanwhile, it's very politically costly. To do another deal with Iran that will result in a lot of domestic political heat. And the US position is that they're simply not going to remove sanctions, unless Iran immediately goes back to all of its commitments. And so it's just they're kind of stuck. And the other thing is both countries are really looking much more to other priorities. The Iran is developing its relationship much more with China, and the US is much more concerned about its relationship with China than it is in the Middle East. So, it's not a priority politically the way that it was for either country in 2009 when the negotiations first kind of got underway. So I'm a little pessimistic about the whole thing.
Well, so speaking of deals, it makes me think of the Abraham Accords, which were signed in August 2020, which many have been hailing for initiating, a phase of normalization between Israel and Persian Gulf monarchies. But what are the implications of the Abraham Accords for Iran and certainly for the US's dynamic in that region? And is the prospect of alleged security threats from Iran really as troublesome as pundits and hawks make it out to be?
Sorry, is which, sorry, say the second part of that?
Oh, so, we read a lot about potential threats from Iran, oftentimes with not a lot of evidence. So do the Abraham Accords, is this about further isolating Iran in the region?
Not exactly. I mean, it's not. It's certainly part of it, yes. But it's a significant part of it. Look, I don't think that the Abraham. Look, the normalization of Iran by a handful of Persian Gulf monarchies and a couple of other countries that never really were frontline enemies of Israel is not going to have a make meaningful difference to the way that Iran is dealt with in the United States. The fact is, these are countries that all that did was to make public and official something that had been going on for a number of years, which was a realignment of allegiances and alliances in the region, where you had these so-called moderate Arab states, by which we really mean pro-American Arab states, and Israel closing ranks against Iran. I mean, that's would continue with or without these accords. It's not like it doesn't make a fundamental shift in terms of the geopolitics of the region. In terms of the Iranian threat, I do think that this is a threat that has largely been hyped and is largely political. Iran is a very, very weak country in terms of its conventional military capabilities, and it doesn't have unconventional military capabilities. There's a lot of hype about its nuclear program, but it doesn't have nuclear weapons. It doesn't have chemical weapons, biological weapons. And it has missiles with a very limited reach, still, relatively limited reach. And, it's not a country that's about to start a war with anyone in its region because it knows that wouldn't end well for it, because it's a very politically isolated country. It's funny to me the way that Iran has been turned into this massive threat. It just makes no logical sense, because Iran is a threat to no one. We're the world's largest, most significant superpower, the most powerful country on earth with 6,000 nuclear weapons, is supposed to be afraid of a deeply isolated country with a weak conventional military capability and out of date, weaponry. And I mean, it just,
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I'm trying to formulate a question about, so Iran's support for insurgencies and other regimes in the region, or proxy wars, or situations like Yemen. Do we read this more as posture than anything else?
No, it's an insurance policy, and it's sort of asymmetric warfare, or an asymmetric kind of posture. It's not. No, I mean, look, for Iran, support for a group like Hezbollah, for example, in Lebanon, performs multiple functions. It satisfies a certain ideological bent that exists domestically within the Islamic Republic. It also buys Iran soft power in Lebanon, which is useful for a country that doesn't have a lot of allies. But also it provides a very clear insurance policy against an Israeli attack on Iran. To have a militia on Israel's border, for example, makes Israel think twice before attacking Iran. Iran has no really significant state level, like, close allies. I mean, the Syrian government, has problems of its own, to say the least. So it needs these kinds of asymmetric alliances and proxy militias as well.
Well, we mentioned earlier that we had a program yesterday on the Uyghurs in China, and you also just mentioned Iran focusing more on relations with folks like China. How does China, or how does Iran reconcile being a Muslim majority country, a country that is actually oppressing its ethnic minority who are Muslim? Is that just left off the table? How does that figure into the relationship between Iran and China?
Yeah, I understand the question where it comes from, but it's interesting to me because, that's one of I think the most common misperceptions about Iran. The idea that somehow because you're an Islamic Republic, that somehow you're going to support every Muslim everywhere in the world, no matter what. I mean, life just doesn't work that way. Politics doesn't work that way. There are a whole lot of other considerations that come into play. one of Iran's closest allies, or I wouldn't say one of Iran's closest allies. Some of you may be aware that Armenia and Azerbaijan have very bad relations. They fought a war about a year ago. They've actually fought a couple of wars. Armenia is a Christian country. Azerbaijan is a Muslim country and Iran has a very large ethnic Azeri population. It's the largest ethnic group in Iran after Persians. Something like 20–25% of Iranians are at least part Azeri. Naturally, you would expect Iran to ally with Azerbaijan to take its side against Armenia. Guess what? Iran is actually much friendlier with Armenia, and Israel is much friendlier with Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is right on Iran's border. It's a useful ally for Israel. I mean, these things. Being a co-religionist is not going to. I mean, look, the relationship with China is always going to be much more important to Iran than any kind of goodwill it might buy for itself by supporting the Uyghur cause. Remember that the Uyghur cause, look, and this is said with no judgment about its merits or not. The Uyghur cause is one that has been championed by the political elite of Western countries. That doesn't mean that it's not a legitimate cause. It just means that there is also an instrumentality to it. It is no wonder that it's something that both progressives and conservatives in the U.S. Actually often agree on. Is China's horrible treatment of the Uyghurs? Because guess what? Is this because every single person that you hear in the Senate or on Fox News or whatever bringing this up because their hearts are bleeding for the Uyghurs? I mean, I think you're all smarter than that. And that's, again, to take nothing away from the actual merits of the the cause. Similarly, who is Iran going to? I mean, are they going to take up a cause that is being championed by sort of Americans as a way to kind of make a dig at China, or are they going to cultivate their relations with the one and only superpower that actually is able to stand up to the United States when it comes to things like American sanctions?
Great way to frame it. To circle it back onto Iran, I mean, as a historian, I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the Iranian government's discrimination against religious minorities. Is that something historic, or is that something that has been more prevalent post-1979?
It's taken different forms, different shapes, and this is not something I'm an expert on. I want to hasten to add. There are people who know much more about this and have written books on these things, but it depends on which religious minority you're talking about. There are some religious minorities like the Baha'i who have always been very poorly treated in Iran because they are not seen as a legitimate religion. They're seen as a sort of cult that grew up in the 19th century, similar to the way the Chinese look at the Falun Gong. And it doesn't matter who's in power in Iran. That's likely to be the case. There are other religious minorities that have been treated better in the Islamic Republic or better under the Shah's period. It varies. Generally speaking, and this is something, again, that may not be a popular point of view or may not be politically convenient, but despite how it may be presented, Iran, at least officially, is much more sympathetic to what they call people who are Ahl al-Haq, which is a people of the book. So Jews, Armenian Christians, Assyrian Christians, and Chaldean Christians are specially protected minorities in Iran with their own seats, specially reserved seats in parliament under the Iranian constitution. And that is also true of Zoroastrians, who are not Ahl al-Haq, they're not people of the book, but they are, because Zoroastrianism began in Iran, it's a pre-Islamic religion of Iran, as a special place in Iranian history. Now, does that mean that there is no discrimination ever against Jews or Armenians or Assyrians or or Zoroastrians in Iran? No, of course not. There is a huge glass ceiling, for example, in politics, and you're not likely to become elected president of Iran if you're Jewish or Zoroastrian or Assyrian. That's just not very likely to happen. That's also not going to happen probably if you're a Sunni Muslim, by the way, who don't have special protections under the constitution. They don't have special privileges or seats in the parliament, but there is a small Sunni Muslim minority in Iran as well. So I don't know. I mean, it's one of these things that does vary with time. Iran's official, well, I'll leave it at that. But, yeah.
Well, so to bring it back to the U.S. and Iran question, does the long diplomatic estrangement between our two countries mean that there's a dearth of American knowledge of Iran, and how has that changed or not since the revolution?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the last American ambassador to Iran, William Sullivan, died, I think, about a year ago or so. He was in his, I think, in his 90s by that point. I mean, it was the end of an era, the last of a generation of Americans who had really served in Iran and knew Iran, not from a distance, not from things they read on the internet, and not from, you know, their sources on the ground or what have you, but actually had like lived and breathed a life in Iran. And vice versa. The last Iranian ambassador to the United States, Ardashir Zahedi, actually died last week at the age of 93 in Switzerland. And he'd actually contacted me a few months ago to tell me that how excited he was to see my book, actually, which was not something I had expected. So yeah, I mean, I think that over 40 years, a lot has been lost. I think there's a chasm, a gulf of understanding between these two countries that even the worst moments of the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union didn't exist. There was still more contact, and there were embassies. There were official relations. I don't understand why it needs to be this way. You know, again, you know, I mean, I understand how it's become this way historically, but I'm not sure it's necessary. There could be a lot more understanding.
Well, I'm often thinking about the sort of strength and the of the Islamic Republic. I mean, how do they maintain a relationship, especially with youth in the country? I mean, you've got over 60% of the, what is it, 80 million people are under the age of 30. So can Iran continue to meet a growing youth population's needs? And is there any fear that from the Islamic Republic of democratic uprisings, a la, you know, Tunisia or Myanmar or Hong Kong?
There's no question that the Islamic Republic definitely has a sort of legitimacy deficit and a sort of popularity deficit, particularly, and I would be careful about just assuming it's just sort of young people. There are actually plenty of young people in Iran who are strong supporters of the Islamic Republic, and there are plenty of old people and middle-aged people who are strong opponents. It's not as simple as just, you know, this kind of young, hip, dynamic, you know, Western kind of, you know, population that's being oppressed by this Islamic. It's not as simple as that. You know, Iranians come in many, many different political stripes, just like people in any country. There's a wide spectrum of political opinion. You know, I think that there is no question that the Islamic Republic is at the lowest point of its popularity, has never been as unpopular with its people as it is today. In its 40-year history, it's definitely at its lowest point. And there are many reasons for that. People argue about the reasons, but it's still there. And it's not as unpopular as is sometimes presented in the media in the United States. Is there some sort of widespread love of the Islamic Republic in Iran today? No, I don't think so. But is this a population that is itching for revolution or regime change, particularly foreign-led regime change? Absolutely not. Iranians are not idiots. They see what's happened in the region around them. They have seen the absolutely cataclysmically disastrous history of the last 20 plus years of American-led regime change, movements of various kinds in the region. None of them have really ended very well. All of them have involved a certain amount, a pretty strong amount of bloodshed. You know, civil war in the case of Syria. Iran, there is no really obvious viable opposition for people to get behind. Iranians are very well aware of the fact that these kind of maximum pressure campaigns that the U.S. tries to place by starving the economy and placing the most severe sanctions that have ever been placed on the history of sanctions in peacetime on any country ever. The complete shutting off of the Iranian economy at great personal cost and human cost. the idea that somehow this is going to make Iranians rise up and overthrow the Islamic Republic, you know, has it created more unpopularity for the Islamic Republic? Yes. But are Iranians dumb enough to think that somehow, you know, that the U.S. is doing this, you know, out of some kind of great love for the Iranian people? No. And they don't want to be part of, for the most part, they don't want to be part of some kind of, you know, regime change ideas. You know, would people like to see things done differently, less corruption, you know, better economy, less inflation, you know, all those kinds of things that people struggle in all kinds of countries, you know, absolutely. Are there large numbers of Iranians who are concerned about, who are upset by living in an Islamic Republic and the limitations on the personal freedoms that that implies? Yes, absolutely. Is that a majority? I'm actually not so sure. You know, don't be, you know, there is a very large, a significant constituency of Iranians, particularly those who are younger, more middle class, more urban, more wealthy, more cosmopolitan, more traveled, who may feel that way. They absolutely want to see the end of any kind of Islamic Republic. They want to see a sort of secular style democracy and so on. I don't know that that's actually a majority in Iran, to be honest. That doesn't mean that there's a majority, you know, sort of love of the Islamic Republic either. It's just, there's a real spectrum of opinion. You know.
Well, and it makes me wonder, I mean, is there a disconnect between the Islamic Republic and you know, the critical mass of the population as a whole? I mean, I'm thinking back in your book, you write about the Shah's big Persepolis celebration for the, you know, what is it, 2,500 years of the Persian Empire, but at the height of corruption and jailing people and, you know, basically throwing a big party to distract a nation as a whole. Is the Islamic Republic in danger of just losing touch with where people are at, or are they holding firm enough on the control that we're not going to see a Shah jumping the shark at Persepolis moment?
Yeah, no, they are in danger of losing. I mean, they have lost a lot of credibility and popularity with the people. There's no question about it. But that doesn't mean that, you know, this is a house of cards that's about to collapse. And that's where I think that sometimes that distinction gets missed. You know, 40 years of these predictions that we've seen in Washington about, you know, how much longer can, you know, these guys are smart and they're very, very good political operators, and they've held on, and they've done that, you know, against incredible odds, you know, whether you like them or not. You know, so there isn't an exact comparison to be made with the Shah, and they've learned from the Shah. You know, they've learned from his mistakes. You know, the Islamic Republic has allowed elements of popular participation in elections in a way that the Shah didn't. Doesn't mean Iran is a pure, you know, perfect democracy by any stretch of the imagination, but they have, you know, they have built institutions and created buy-in, you know, across the society, and they've entrenched themselves very, very well. You know, it will be interesting to see what happens when the supreme leader passes away. He's well into his 80s now, so you know that is a definite moment of transition. But betting against the Islamic Republic has not proved to be a very strong bet in the last 40 years.
So Zarif, the foreign minister, you were talking about people being smart. I mean, highly regarded, very, very shrewd, American educated. In fact, somebody once remarked he was in the same class as Condoleezza Rice, and they said that he was actually the best student in that class that year. But do you think that somebody like Zarif, who has such international respect, does he have designs on leadership, or, you know, is he presidential material?
Well, I should mention, first of all, he's not foreign minister anymore. So there was an election in Iran in June. Well, so Iranian presidents are term limited to 2 4-year terms, just like in the United States. And it was the end of the 8 years of the Rouhani administration, so they were not eligible to be reelected. The new administration, of course, is a much more hardline, much more conservative administration, and they have a new foreign minister. So Zarif is living a private life as a private citizen right now in Iran. Does he have any? I don't think he's a viable candidate for presidential politics for a number of reasons. You know, maybe in a few years' time, I don't think things would have to change, but not right now. The US withdrawal from the nuclear deal in 2018 made it very difficult for any reformist, negotiation-minded, diplomacy-minded Iranian government to come to power anytime soon, because that completely humiliated Zarif and Rouhani and that entire administration, because they sold everyone on this idea of that you can do a deal. No, you can talk to America, you can do a deal with America. Look, we did this amazing historic deal with the United States, got some sanctions relief, and then the hardliners, the conservatives, were proved right, whether we want them to be or not. And they don't, because they had always been warning, no, you can't trust America. And it's just made it very easy for them to say, look, no, these guys were idiots. They got taken in. Zarif is not viable material right now, at least for a while.
Well, so thinking about our current relationship, I'm wondering, looking backwards, because as you're saying, you're not a fortune teller, you are a historian. How critical was US intervention in Iraq to the shape of the modern bilateral relationship that we're seeing?
Yeah, very important. That was one of the best things the US ever did for Iran, of course, is removed its two greatest enemies to the west and to the east, the Taliban in Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And that strengthened Iran's position very much about 10, 15 years ago. Things have changed since then for a number of reasons. US has taken a much harder line with Iran, imposed much stronger sanctions. Iran's support for the Syrian government has definitely reduced its soft power and influence in the region among the Arab street. It's just not in the same position of strength that it used to be. Of course, the Taliban are back. Iran's influence in Iraq is not as strong as I think sometimes it's presented. And of course, most importantly, Iran is very weakened with its economy and the sanctions at the moment. It's still, though, it has created a headache for the United States in Iraq, for sure. Support for some of these proxy militias, Iran's general influence among some of the political parties in Iraq. Although I think that's lower than, it's at a lower point than it used to be. A lot of even Shia political parties and Shia communities in Iraq are much less pro-Iranian than they used to be, and are much more into the idea of independent sovereign action.
So I like to think of history as a social activity. That it's something that it's not something that we just shove into the corner and wait for it to get dusty. And you've been asked about this before. You've written that history can be a force for peace. And I'm wondering what possibilities you see for peace in the region.
Yes, I mean, I'm not naive enough, of course, to believe that somehow my book is going to bring, the United States and Iran back together. But I do think that history can be a force for peace. It can liberate us from these things. People have often said that the United States and Iran are trapped in, 1953 and 1979, that they're stuck in this kind of history. Neither country has fully apologized for either the hostage crisis or the CIA overthrow of Mossadegh, and that they're trapped in. I don't accept that. I don't believe that there are people in the State Department or in the Foreign Ministry in Tehran sitting there going, yeah, we'd be happy to make peace with the United States or with Iran, but if only they would I just can't get over that hostage crisis. That stuff, it's actually pretty far in the past now. I think quite the opposite. History has the ability to liberate us from these kinds of enmities. All you have to do is read my book and see just how long this relationship was full of warmth and positivity and mutual good feeling, and realize there's no real reason why it couldn't be that way again. There are political reasons, and those political reasons can be dealt with politically. I mean, the United States dropped actual literal nuclear bombs on Japan, in our lifetimes, some of our lifetimes. And the United States and Japan now have a very friendly relationship. I mean, things can change. Things don't need to stay the way they are forever.
It's a good answer. John, thanks for some great conversation, some really probing answers to some good questions. I want to bring Derek back in to take us out into the day and remind our audience that the link to order the book is there in the chat. And it is fantastic to look at this through the the long arc of history as opposed to the blips in the headlines and the Twitter feeds, which so often inform us. So thanks a lot again.
My pleasure. It's really a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Tim. Really appreciate this excellent dialogue, and encourage the audience to pick up the book through our partners, Broadway Books. If you have someone you think would be interested in hearing this but wasn't able to attend today, we'll be posting up shortly on our YouTube channel. The video for this, again, as I mentioned before, we have video of everything up to even yesterday's program that Tim has already posted on the YouTube channel. So I encourage you to find and to share there. And just a hint of things to come. You might have seen in our e-newsletter that Great Decisions, which we conduct every year in partnership with the Foreign Policy Association, is coming in January. And so we've sent out some sort of save the date, get interested. You can order your books through the Foreign Policy Association, and in a week or two, we'll have registration up. So look out for that. Thanks for joining us today. Everyone stay safe, be well, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Bye-bye.